In the last week of November 1886, when the snow had already hardened in the wagon ruts outside Crow's Crossing, and the first serious winter storm was still only a dark line beyond the northern hills, Silas Avery began tearing apart the safest-looking wall of his cabin. It was the east wall, the wall facing away from the wind, the wall every sensible settler kept thick, tight, and packed with mud before winter came down over the Montana Territory. Silas removed 3 whole planks from it before noon. Then he took a crosscut saw and widened the opening until a man could have crawled through it on his hands and knees. His wife Eleanor stood in the doorway with their daughter Ruth beside her, watching cold light pour through the gap into the cabin. Their youngest boy, Amos, sat wrapped in a quilt near the stove, coughing into his sleeve. "Silas," Eleanor said at last, "tell me that isn't staying open." Silas did not look up from his work. He was shaving the edge of a pine board with a draw knife, calm and careful, as though he were repairing a chair instead of opening his home to winter. "It has to stay open," he said. Outside, a freight wagon slowed on the road. 2 men aboard watched him pull another plank free. One of them laughed. The other crossed himself. By sundown, the story had reached the blacksmith shop, the trading post, and the small church at the edge of town. Silas Avery had gone mad, people said. The man had lost his storehouse in the October fire, spent his savings on medicine for a sickly child, and now he was cutting a hole through his own cabin before the worst winter in 10 years. But Silas was not trying to let the cold inside. He was trying to teach the smoke where to go. Because there was something no one in Crow's Crossing understood yet. When the blizzard came, the snow would not be the first thing to threaten his family. The first danger would be silence. The kind of silence that came when a chimney disappeared beneath snow. The kind that turned a warm cabin into a sealed box. And if Silas was wrong, the smoke would save no one. It would kill them before morning. What made a man tear open his own cabin on the edge of winter? And why would the very smoke that frightened his neighbours become the only thing that showed his family the way out? Stay with this story, because before the storm was over, every person in Crow's Crossing would learn that a wall was not always protection, and an opening was not always weakness. Silas Avery had not always lived in a cabin so small that a person could cross it in 9 steps. For 11 years he had worked maintenance along the Northern Pacific Line, mending cracked water tanks, replacing warped platform boards, crawling under snowbound freight cars to clear frozen brake chains. He was not a railroad man in the shining button sense. He never wore a conductor's cap. He did not make speeches or wave lanterns from the rear platform. He was the man sent out after the weather had already done its damage. He understood wood under pressure. He understood iron when it shrank in cold. He understood that every structure, no matter how strong it appeared from a distance, had one place where the weather would begin asking questions. Most men thought a storm attacked a building head-on. Silas had learned otherwise. Wind did not always break a wall. It searched. It found a lifted shingle, a loose nail, a crack around a window frame. Then it kept moving through that weakness until the whole building began to fail around it. When he was 36, working a depot repair crew east of Eleanor, Silas spent one February night inside a buried station house with 4 other men. The storm had come down off the range with no warning. By midnight it had packed snow against the roofline. By dawn the chimney had vanished beneath a drift taller than a horse. The station agent woke them by shouting that the stove had gone wrong. At first none of the men understood what he meant. The fire was still burning, the room was warm. Too warm, in fact. The air had thickened, their heads hurt. One of the younger crewmen was sick beside the coal bin. Another sat against the wall with his eyes closed, too tired to stand. Silas was the first to notice the smoke, hanging low beneath the ceiling. Not rising, hanging. The chimney was blocked. The stove had nowhere to breathe, and neither did they. The men fought their way to the front door, but the drift outside pressed against it like stone. They dug for nearly an hour before opening a gap no wider than a wash basin. By then, the young crewman beside the coal bin could no longer answer when called. He survived, barely. But Silas never forgot the sight of smoke trapped in a room that was supposed to keep people safe. Years later, after he left the railroad and brought Eleanor west to Crow's Crossing, he built their cabin with that memory still living somewhere behind his eyes. At first, Eleanor thought his caution was simply the habit of a man who had spent too many winters outdoors. He lined the stovepipe with sheet iron where it passed through the roof. He kept a shovel hanging inside the front room instead of outside by the woodpile. He marked the chimney height with a black cedar pole taller than the ridgeline. But when he began building the strange opening into the east wall, even Eleanor could not see the sense in it. The opening was not a door. It sat low to the floor, behind the stove and beside the small pantry shelf. Silas framed it with thick boards and covered it from the outside with a wooden hood that slanted down toward the ground. A narrow tunnel ran behind the hood, turning twice before it entered the cabin. Snow could not blow straight through it. Wind could not easily find a path inside. At the inner end, he built a sliding panel, fitted tight enough to close in ordinary weather. "It is an air passage," he told Eleanor. "We have windows. Windows freeze shut, doors drift over, chimneys fill." She looked at the dark opening low in the wall. "And this doesn't?" Silas ran his hand along the hood outside. "Not if the smoke can tell us where it is." That answer made no sense to her then. It would make no sense to almost everyone, until the night it mattered. The morning after Silas cut the wall open, Pastor Alden came up from town with a sack of flour under one arm and concern written plainly across his face. He was a gentleman who had buried more settlers than he had baptized. He knew when concern could become insult, so he stood by the woodpile for a long time before saying anything at all. "Eleanor says Amos has been coughing again," he said. Silas nodded. "Then she says you are making changes to the cabin." "I am." The pastor looked toward the low hood on the east side. "Folks are worried. Folks are always worried when they see work they don't recognize." Pastor Alden smiled faintly, but it did not last. Winter is not a season that allows much room for experiments. Silas set down his hammer. "This isn't an experiment." "Then what is it?" For a moment, Silas looked beyond the pastor, out across the dry grass and frozen wheel tracks, toward the distant hills. The north horizon had become flat and pale. He had seen that colour before. It was not snow yet. It was weather gathering itself. "A second breath," he said quietly. Pastor Alden looked at the little opening again. For the cabin, for the people in it. The pastor left the flower and said he would pray for the Avery family. Silas thanked him. After the pastor had gone, Eleanor came outside, carrying Amos on her hip. "Do you think he believes you?" she asked. "No." "Do you?" Silas looked at his son. Amos was 4 years old, small for his age, with a chest that tightened whenever cold weather arrived. The doctor in Eleanor had said the boy needed dry air, rest, and luck. Silas had been able to afford only one of those things. "I believe winter doesn't care what people think," he said. For the next 10 days he prepared without explaining much more. He split extra wood and stacked it inside the cabin, not against the wall. He filled every water bucket. He moved the children's bedding away from the stove, then moved it back again after measuring the space. He made a small rack of wire above the stovepipe and tied strips of cloth to it. Ruth watched him with the serious attention of a child who had learned that adults sometimes hid fear behind ordinary chores. "What are those for?" she asked, touching one of the strips. "To watch the air." "Air doesn't do anything." Silas smiled despite himself. "It does everything. You just don't see it." He showed her how the cloth moved when the stove drew properly. He opened the low wall passage a finger width. A thin current entered the cabin, crossed low along the floor, and rose near the stove. The cloth strips lifted toward the ceiling. "See?" he said. "The fire pulls air up the chimney. Fresh air comes in low. If that stops, the cloth tells us." Ruth watched the strips dance. "And if the chimney is full of snow?" Silas's face changed, only slightly. "Then we do not wait for it to tell us twice." By the first day of December, every sign in Crow's Crossing pointed toward a heavy storm. Horses grew restless in their pens. The old men at the trading post stopped arguing about politics and began discussing wind direction. A flock of crows moved south in a ragged black line before noon. The sky turned the colour of dull iron. That evening, Deputy Kellen rode from house to house, warning people to bring animals in and avoid the road after dark. When he reached the Avery place, he stared at the hood on the east wall. "Still got that hole?" he asked. "Still got it. You ought to board it over." "I built it to be there." Kellen pulled his scarf higher over his mouth. "Storm might be the one to decide." "Storm decides plenty," Silas said. "Not that." By midnight, snow began tapping against the window glass. It was almost gentle at first. Eleanor tucked the children into bed. Silas sat at the table, sharpening the edge of the shovel. The stove glowed red behind its iron door. The cloth strips above it moved in their familiar, slow rhythm. Then, shortly after 1 in the morning, the wind arrived. It did not build gradually. It struck the north side of the cabin with one long blow that made the roof beams groan and sent a small cloud of soot drifting down from the stovepipe. Amos woke crying. Eleanor gathered him close. Ruth sat up beneath her blanket, eyes wide in the dark. Silas stood and listened. The wind had 1,000 voices around the cabin. It hissed beneath the eaves. It hammered the shutters. It moved across the roof in a deep, rolling pressure that sounded less like weather than a heavy wagon passing overhead. Still, the fire burned cleanly. For 3 hours the family waited while the storm gathered force. Silas fed the stove, one split log at a time. He checked the cloth strips. He checked the chimney marker through the north window until snow erased it. At dawn, there was no dawn. The glass had become a pale wall of white. Eleanor made coffee with water heated on the stove. Nobody drank much. The air inside was warm but close, carrying wool, smoke, and the sharp scent of pine resin. Outside, the storm kept pressing. At mid-morning, Silas tried the front door. It moved less than an inch. Snow had packed against it through the night. "Is it stuck?" Ruth asked. "It is resting," Silas said. He did not want to frighten her. But he took the shovel from its hook and laid it beside the door. Near noon, the first cloth strip stopped moving. Silas saw it from across the room. The red strip nearest the stovepipe, which had lifted and curled all morning, now hung straight down. He stood so quickly that his chair fell backward. Eleanor looked at him. "What is it?" Silas crossed the room and held his hand above the stove. The heat was there, but the fire behind the iron door had changed. Its sound was duller. The bright, hungry roar had become a weak, uneven flutter. He opened the stove door a crack. Smoke rolled out into the room. Not much, not yet, but enough. Silas shut the door and went to the wall passage. He slid the inner panel open. A thin stream of cold air entered along the floor. The cloth strips stirred, then fell still again. "The chimney," Eleanor said. Silas nodded. "Can you clear it?" He looked toward the buried door. Even if he could force it open, the roof was above a wall of snow. The chimney could be buried by 6 feet, maybe more. A man outside in that wind would lose direction in seconds. "Not from outside," he said. The room was silent, except for the storm. Eleanor pressed Amos closer to her. "Then what do we do?" Silas went to the stove and pulled the draft lever closed. The fire dimmed. He removed one burning log with iron tongs and dropped it into the ashpan, then another. Smoke thickened near the ceiling, grey and slow. "We make the fire smaller," he said. "We keep air moving through the low passage." "That little opening?" "It will tell us if the passage is clear." He took the oil lamp from the table and placed it on the floor beside the opening. The flame leaned gently inward toward the cabin. Fresh air was coming in. But the smoke did not rise. It began to spread across the ceiling in a thin, dark layer. Silas opened the small rear window. It had frozen shut. He tried the second. It did not move. The cabin, built to keep winter out, had closed itself around them. Amos coughed again. This time the cough did not stop quickly. Eleanor's face went pale. "Silas." He knelt beside the low passage and placed his cheek near the floor. The air entering was cold, clean, and steady. Then he noticed something else. The smoke above them was slowly sinking, not because the room was filling completely, because the stove had stopped drawing it upward, and the fresh air entering low was forcing the smoke toward the opposite side of the cabin, toward the buried front door. Silas looked at the floor plan he had measured 100 times, a low opening, a small source of fresh air, a trapped room with one blocked chimney. The storm had taken the path he expected. It had closed the high exit, but it had not found the second breath. "Eleanor," he said, and his voice was suddenly firm, "move the children low. Put the quilts on the floor by the east wall." "Why?" "The cleanest air is down here." She did not argue. She wrapped Amos in 2 blankets and took Ruth's hand. They moved beside the strange opening everyone had mocked. Silas wet a cloth and tied it loosely over Amos's nose and mouth. Then he opened the inner panel all the way. Cold air slid across the floor like water. The lamp flame bent hard toward the stove. For one breathless moment, nothing changed. Then the smoke at the ceiling began to shift. It moved away from the children, drawn slowly toward the dim stove and the blocked chimney. Not escaping, not yet, but gathering above the place where Silas could control it. He took the poker and opened the stove door only a fraction. The fire answered with a weak red glow. "Come on," he whispered, not to the fire, but to the air itself. He had built the passage to feed the stove from below. Now he needed that current to do more. He needed it to create enough pressure to push smoke toward the chimney, even if the chimney could not release it fully. He remembered the buried station house. The men had opened the door high, where the drift was deepest, and fought the snow. They had never had a low passage. They had never given the room another way to breathe. Silas took off his coat, rolled it tight, and pressed it along the crack beneath the front door. Then he sealed the gaps around the west window with wet cloth. He was not trying to make the cabin airtight. He was trying to control the air it had. The east passage stayed open. The stove became the only place the current could travel. Minute by minute, the cloth strips above the stove began to lift again. First the blue one, then the red. Then all three moved in the same slow upward pull. Eleanor saw them and held her breath. "Is that good? It means the smoke has a direction." Outside, the blizzard struck the cabin hard enough to shake frost from the window frames. Somewhere near the barn, wood cracked. One of the horses screamed. Silas went to the door and drove the shovel blade into the narrow opening he had made earlier. Snow packed behind it, dense and heavy. He chipped, pulled, and cleared only enough space to reach the outer latch. He could not open the door, but he could feel the pressure on the other side. The drift was climbing. If it covered the east wall hood, the passage would close. That was the weakness he had not told Eleanor about. He had placed the hood on the sheltered side of the cabin, away from the worst wind. But no wind stayed in one direction forever. He crawled back to the opening and touched the air with his bare hand. Still cold, still moving. For the next hour, the family lived close to the floor. Eleanor told Ruth stories in a voice barely louder than the wind. Amos drifted in and out of sleep, his small hand clutching the edge of his mother's sleeve. Silas watched the stove, the cloth strips, the lamp flame, and the dark layer near the ceiling. He did not let the fire grow large. A large fire would make more smoke than the damaged chimney could carry. Instead, he fed it small pieces of dry pine, one at a time, enough to hold warmth in the cabin, but never enough to overpower the passage. It was not comfort, it was balance. At some point after sunset, though no one could see the sun leave, the chimney gave a deep, muffled thump. The stovepipe rattled. The cloth strips dropped. Amos began coughing again. Silas's eyes went to the east wall. The lamp flame beside the opening had gone still. No current. The storm had changed direction. Snow had found the hood. For the first time that day, fear broke through Silas's careful face. Eleanor saw it. What happened? He did not answer immediately. He opened the low panel and shoved his arm into the passage. Snow met his fingers only a few inches in. The hood was buried. He pulled his arm back. The cold had turned his fingertips white. The air passage is blocked. Ruth began to cry without making a sound. Silas looked at the wall, then at the stove, then at the narrow crawl space beneath the pantry shelf. The passage had 2 turns. He had built it that way so snow could not blow inside. The second turn was beyond the wall, under the hood, where he could not reach. Unless he went through the passage himself. Eleanor understood before he spoke. No. I can get to the hood from inside. You cannot fit. Not well. Silas, the snow will come in. It will come in anyway if I do nothing. He took the lamp and set it near her. Then he tied a rope around his waist. The other end he gave to Eleanor. It was the same kind of rope he had used for rail work in winter, old hemp with a leather loop at one end. If I pull twice, pull me back. And if you don't? He looked at her. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Silas lay flat on the floor and pushed himself head first into the dark passage. The opening was barely wide enough for his shoulders. The wood pressed against his back. Frozen air stung his face. Ahead, the first bend was packed with powdery snow that had blown through the outer hood and settled against the turn. He dug with his hands. Behind him, he could hear the cabin only faintly, Eleanor calling his name, the stove ticking as it cooled, the long animal roar of the storm. He crawled farther. Snow filled his sleeves, his knuckles struck the boards. The passage turned left, then down. He had built it himself, measuring every angle. Now, inside it, the tunnel seemed smaller than any measurement could explain. He cleared another armful of snow. Then the roof of the passage groaned. The hood outside was under the full weight of the drift. Silas froze. If the boards collapsed, the snow would pin him in a space too narrow to turn around. For a few seconds, all he could hear was his own breathing. He thought of the station house, of the young rail worker lying beside the coal bin, of the thick smoke that had hidden the ceiling, of every time he had told himself he would never let his own family wait for someone else to find a way out. Then he kept digging. At the second bend, his fingers struck something solid, not snow, ice. The wind had packed snow into the hood and melted a thin layer against the warmer cabin wall. It had frozen again into a hard plug. Silas took the small awl from his belt and began chipping. Each strike was tiny. Each one sent pain through his cold hand. The passage gave him no room to lift his arm properly. He worked inch by inch, scraping ice away with the awl, then breaking it with the heel of his palm. Behind him, the rope tightened once. Eleanor was asking if he was all right. Silas pulled once in answer. He chipped again. Then a thread of air touched his face. It was so faint he almost imagined it. He stopped moving. There. A narrow, cold stream slipped through the ice plug and brushed his cheek. Silas dug toward it with both hands. The plug broke all at once. Snow rushed into the passage, dry and sharp, but behind it came air, hard, clean, moving air. The current struck Silas's face and filled his lungs like a blow. He pulled twice on the rope. Eleanor dragged him backward. He emerged from the passage covered in snow, bleeding from both hands, but smiling for the first time since noon. The lamp flame bent low toward the stove. Above them, the cloth strips lifted. The cabin breathed again. For the rest of that night, Silas did not sleep. Every 20 minutes he checked the passage. Every hour he crawled partway into it to clear the snow gathering at the first turn. Eleanor stayed awake beside the children, feeding Amos spoonfuls of warm water and keeping damp cloth over his mouth when smoke thickened. The storm did not weaken. At midnight, the barn roof collapsed. They heard it through the wall. A long, tearing groan, followed by a deep, muffled crash beneath the wind. The horses had been moved into the lean-to earlier that day, but Silas did not know whether the lean-to had held. He could do nothing for them now. At 2 in the morning, a sharp crack split the north window. Snow dust blew through the seam. Silas sealed it with a blanket and a board. At 3, the stove draft failed again. This time, he did not panic. He moved the children lower. He shut the fire down. He opened the wall passage and watched the lamp. The smoke sank, then shifted. The air current returned in thin pulses. The smoke became his map. When it gathered above the stove, he knew the chimney was struggling. When it moved toward the low wall, he knew the passage was drawing. When the cloth strips lifted, he knew the cabin still had a path between cold air outside and heat inside. The smoke that had once terrified him in the buried station house now told him exactly what the storm was doing. It showed him where the cabin was alive. Just before dawn, Ruth woke and whispered, "Papa, is the storm trying to get in?" Silas sat beside her on the floor. His hands were wrapped in strips of cloth. Soot darkened his face. He listened to the wind search along the walls. "It is," he said. "Will it?" He looked at the open panel in the east wall. "Not if we keep showing it the way through." The second day was worse than the first. By then the cabin had become a buried room. No light entered through the windows. The front door could not be found from inside except by touch. The chimney marker was gone. The snow outside pressed so heavily against the north wall that the boards bowed inward between the braces. But the east wall passage kept working. Silas began to understand why. The hood had been buried, yes, but the drift itself was not solid. Snow packed around the outer slats created a pocket where wind slowed before reaching the turns in the passage. The storm had made its own filter. It had not sealed the opening completely because the opening had never faced the wind directly. By late afternoon, the smoke layer near the ceiling had thinned. The chimney was still partly blocked, but the small, controlled fire and the low current were keeping the air inside breathable. Eleanor saw the change. "You knew this would happen," she said. Silas shook his head. "I knew it could." "That is not the same thing." "No." She looked at the passage, then at her sleeping children. "Why didn't you tell me how dangerous it was?" Silas had no good answer. He had thought if he built enough, measured enough, prepared enough, he could keep fear outside with the snow. "Because I wanted to be certain before I scared you," he said. Eleanor gave a tired laugh that held no humour. "Silas, we have been scared since the first wall shook." He bowed his head. Then she took his bandaged hand. "Next time," she said, "we are scared together." Near evening, another sound came through the storm. 3 hard knocks against the west wall. Silas stood still. No branch could strike that wall. No loose board from the barn could travel against the wind that way. 3 knocks came again. Eleanor stared at him. Someone is outside. Silas went to the window, but there was nothing beyond the snow pressed against the glass. He listened. The knock came a third time, farther down, near the buried front door. He took the shovel. "Stay with the children," he said. "You can't open it." "I am not opening it." He crawled to the low east passage and lifted the inner panel. Cold air swept along the floor. Then he went to the front door and began digging through the narrow gap at its base. He did not need to clear the door. He needed only to make a small tunnel outward. It took 20 minutes to break through. When the shovel blade finally punched into open snow, a muffled voice called from outside. "Avery!" It was Deputy Kellen. Silas put his mouth close to the opening. "How many?" "2. Me and Mrs. Bell. Her house came apart." Silas closed his eyes for 1 second. Mrs. Bell was 73. She lived alone in the nearest cabin south of town. Her roof had been weak since summer. "Can you reach the east wall?" Silas shouted. "What?" "Follow the cabin around. Find the low hood." "Can't see a thing." "Keep one hand on the wall. Go east." The storm swallowed the voices. Silas waited, listening to the scrape of bodies against wood. Then, after what felt like an hour, but was probably less than 5 minutes, he heard a dull thump at the east passage. He opened the inner panel. A gloved hand came through the tunnel first, then Kellen's face, white with frost. "Your hole is too small," the deputy gasped. "It is not a hole." "Whatever it is, Mrs. Bell won't fit." Silas looked toward the pantry shelf. The passage was narrow by design. It was meant for air, not people. But beyond the first turn, the outer hood had a larger pocket beneath it. He could widen the inner frame. He grabbed the hammer and began pulling boards free. Eleanor watched without speaking. She knew what he was doing. The more he opened the passage, the more snow and wind could enter. But outside, an old woman was dying in the drift. Silas tore away the lower frame until the opening was wide enough for shoulders. "Bring her head first," he called. Kellen disappeared into the snow. For several minutes there was only the storm and the sound of Silas breathing. Then a grey wool blanket appeared in the passage. Beneath it was Mrs. Bell, barely conscious, her hair stiff with ice. Silas and Eleanor pulled together. The old woman came through inch by inch, dragged over the cabin floor, while snow blew around her. Kellen followed last, wedging himself through the widened passage with one shoulder. Silas slammed the inner panel partly closed behind him, leaving a narrow, controlled gap at the bottom. For a moment, everyone lay on the floor, coughing and gasping. Then Amos began to cry. Eleanor laughed through tears and pulled him close. The small cabin now held 6 people, 1 dim stove, a damaged chimney, and a wall that had been opened wider than Silas had ever planned. Kellen looked at the passage, then at the cloth strips moving above the stove. "You built an escape tunnel," he said. Silas shook his head. "No." "Then what is it?" Silas looked at Mrs. Bell, whose frozen hands Eleanor was warming between blankets. He looked at his children. He looked at the low opening where cold air continued to enter, not as an enemy now, but as the thing allowing every person in the room to breathe. It is the reason the smoke has somewhere else to go. The third night was the longest. The storm's force finally began to change, but not in the way anyone hoped. The wind dropped for an hour, then returned from the east. Snow that had been packed against the north side loosened and shifted. The cabin groaned under the changing pressure. The widened passage became harder to control. Silas and Kellen took turns kneeling beside it, blocking part of the opening with boards and blankets, while leaving enough space for air. They watched the lamp flame. They watched the cloth strips. They watched the smoke. Mrs. Bell woke just before midnight. Her voice was faint but clear. "Did I die?" "Not today," Eleanor said. Mrs. Bell looked around the cabin. "Where am I?" "Silas Avery's." The old woman noticed the broken wall and frowned. "I knew he was foolish." Kellen laughed once, a short, exhausted sound. "You came through that foolishness," he said. For the first time since the storm began, Mrs. Bell smiled. By dawn on the fourth day, the wind was gone. Not weakened, gone. The silence afterward was so complete that Ruth woke and asked whether everyone had stopped breathing. Silas rose carefully. His legs felt like wood. He went to the front door and began digging. This time the snow beyond it was different. It did not push back with the force of moving wind. It fell away in quiet blocks. Kellen joined him. Together they carved a narrow passage upward through the drift. After nearly an hour, daylight broke through. It was not bright at first, only a pale blue line above the shovel blade. Then cold morning air poured in. Silas climbed out onto the roof-high drift and stood still. Crow's Crossing had vanished. The road was gone. Fences were gone. The barn was a broken shape beneath snow. Farther south, smoke rose from the town in thin lines, but several cabins had disappeared almost completely. Silas turned back toward his own home. Only the chimney top showed above the drift, blackened and packed with snow. The cabin had survived because the wall everyone thought should remain sealed had given it another path to breathe. But getting out of the cabin did not mean the danger had ended. The storm had left a world that looked quiet only because it had exhausted everything capable of making noise. Silas stood on the drift for a long moment, forcing his eyes across the whiteness until they learned to understand it again. The barn had lost half its roof. The lean-to still stood, bent and buried, but intact enough that he heard the horses before he saw them. Their low, anxious whickering came from beneath a heavy slope of snow and broken boards. Silas started toward it, and Kellen caught his sleeve. "Not alone," the deputy said. They tied the same hemp rope between them and moved slowly down the drift, testing each step with a fence rail. The snow did not look dangerous. That was what made it dangerous. It lay smooth over collapsed wood, open feed trenches, broken harness hooks, and air pockets where a man could disappear to his waist without warning. At the lean-to, Silas found the horses pressed close together behind a fallen beam. Their winter coats were crusted with frost, but they were alive. The animals had survived for the same reason the people in the cabin had survived. The drift had piled against the outside, cutting the worst wind away before it could reach them. Silas cleared a small gap, gave them water from a half-frozen barrel, and stood with his forehead against the old mare's neck until her shaking eased. Only then did he understand how close the whole homestead had come to becoming a collection of separate graves, beneath the same snow. By midday, other shapes began appearing on the white plain. At first, Silas thought they were stumps or fence posts emerging from the drift. Then one lifted an arm. It was a boy from the Jenkins place, 12 years old, walking ahead of his father with a rope tied around his waist. They had seen smoke from the Avery chimney after the wind stopped and had followed it across the buried road. The father asked if there was room inside. Silas looked at the cabin, then at the boy's blue lips, then at Eleanor standing in the doorway, with Mrs. Bell wrapped in blankets behind her. There was no spare room, there was no extra bed, but there was still air. "Come in," Silas said. By nightfall, the Avery cabin held 10 people. The Jenkins father and son slept against the south wall. Kellen sat beside the stove with one hand on its draft lever. Mrs. Bell, who had not spoken a full sentence in 2 days, directed Eleanor on how to stretch cornmeal into enough hot mash for everyone. Ruth gave up her blanket without being asked. Amos, feeling stronger after the smoke cleared, watched every new arrival as if the cabin had become a strange ship gathering survivors from a sea of snow. No one complained about the close quarters. They had all seen what waited outside. The chimney was still partly buried, and Silas did not trust the calm. He kept the stove fire low. He kept the widened east passage open only as much as needed. He checked the cloth strips until Kellen could read them too. The deputy learned quickly. When the blue strip curled upward, he knew the stove was drawing. When the lamp flame leaned across the floor, he knew the passage remained clear. When a thin grey ribbon paused above the stove door, he shut the draught without Silas having to speak. For the first time, the strange little wall opening was not merely Silas's private fear made into lumber. It had become something everyone in the room understood. On the second morning after the blizzard, Kellen and the Jenkins father dug a route from the Avery cabin toward town. They did not try to clear the old road. The road had disappeared under drifts taller than their shoulders. Instead, Silas showed them how the snow had collected behind the windbreak fence, and how the crust held firmer there. They carried cedar branches and pushed them upright at intervals, making a line that a person could follow if whiteout returned. It took 4 hours to travel a distance that normally took 20 minutes by wagon. When they reached Crow's Crossing, they found the town changed. The blacksmith shop had lost its front awning. The church bell tower leaned at an angle, its roof packed with snow. 2 cabins near the creek had disappeared completely, except for their stovepipes. People were digging with whatever they had: shovels, stove lids, broken boards, even iron cooking pans. No one laughed at Silas when he arrived with snow still frozen in his beard. They asked questions. At first, he did not know how to answer them. How could he explain that a low opening had saved them without making it sound like a trick? So he took a charcoal stub from the blacksmith's counter and drew a cabin wall on a scrap of packing paper. He drew the stove. He drew the chimney. Then he drew the low passage, the angled hood, and the line of air moving along the floor. "Warm air wants to rise," he said. "A stove can only pull smoke out if it has air to pull from somewhere else." The blacksmith, a broad man named Walter Boone, folded his arms. "Why not crack a window?" Silas pointed toward the buried cabins outside. "Because windows are high. Snow gets high first. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then an older ranch wife named Mabel True said, "And doors?" "Doors are for leaving. This is for staying alive when you can't." That sentence travelled through town faster than any sermon. For the rest of the week, Silas helped wherever he could. He showed Walter Boone how to make a slatted hood that turned the wind away twice before it could enter a passage. He helped the church caretaker mark the chimney with a tall pole painted black so it could be found above a drift. He nailed a shovel bracket inside the schoolhouse door where it could be reached even if the entry filled with snow. At the Jenkins place, he and the 12-year-old boy built a small, low vent behind the kitchen stove. The boy held the lantern while Silas measured the angle. "Will this keep us warm?" he asked. Silas thought of Amos coughing beneath the grey ceiling. "It will help you keep breathing," he said. The boy nodded, as though that was a larger promise. The clean-up lasted almost 3 weeks. Some families left Crow's Crossing as soon as the road could take a wagon south. Others stayed because leaving required money, horses, and certainty that the next place would be kinder. Silas understood that kind of staying. He had once believed a man could protect his family by making every choice alone, by putting up walls strong enough that no one else needed to be involved. The storm had corrected him. His wall passage had saved the people inside only because Eleanor trusted him when there was no time to explain. It had saved Mrs. Bell because Kellen found the cabin in the dark. It had stayed open because everyone took turns clearing it. Strength was not a wall. It was the work people did together when the wall could no longer hold by itself. Late in January, a smaller storm came from the west. It was not like the great blizzard. It carried less snow and lasted only one night. But the town had changed enough that the weather found a different place waiting for it. Chimney poles stood above every roof, shovels hung inside doorways, low vent hoods appeared beside stoves, behind porches, and beneath kitchen windows. When the wind rose, people did not wait for smoke to warn them. They watched the lamp flames, they checked the air. At the Avery cabin, Ruth woke before dawn and went to the stove without calling for her father. She studied the cloth strips. The red one lifted gently. The blue one curled toward the pipe. She placed one small hand on the floor beside the passage and felt a cool current moving beneath her palm. Then she smiled and returned to bed. Silas watched from his chair and said nothing. There were lessons a parent hoped to pass down. Some were about work, some were about kindness. This one was about paying attention before danger became a disaster. Years later, Amos would remember that winter differently from everyone else. He would not remember the smoke as clearly as Eleanor did, or the rope around Silas's waist, or the terrible sound of the barn roof breaking under snow. He would remember the low opening in the wall. He would remember lying beside it on quilts, feeling the clean air touch his face, while the rest of the world vanished into white. And whenever someone asked him how his family survived the winter of 1886, he would say his father did not build a hole in a cabin wall. He built a way for the house to keep breathing. News of the Avery cabin spread through Crow's Crossing before the drifts were fully cleared. Deputy Kellen told the story first, though he told it badly, leaving out the fear and the hours on the floor and the way the smoke hung low above their heads. He told people only that Silas had made a tunnel in his wall and pulled Mrs. Bell through it during the storm. By the time the story reached Eleanor, people were saying Silas had built a secret underground shelter. Others claimed he had predicted the blizzard weeks in advance. One man at the trading post insisted the cabin had stayed warm because the opening caught heat from the earth. Silas corrected no one. He spent the rest of winter repairing the north wall, rebuilding the barn, and reshaping the east passage. He made the outer hood stronger. He added a second set of slats to slow drifting snow. He built a larger inner panel with a removable frame so it could become an emergency exit if needed. But he did not make it beautiful. The passage remained low, awkward, and strange. It looked like a mistake in the side of an otherwise ordinary cabin. That spring, Pastor Alden came by with a sack of seed potatoes and stood beside the repaired wall. "I owe you an apology," he said. Silas was splitting kindling. "For what?" "For mistaking an unfamiliar idea for a dangerous one." Silas set down the axe. "It was dangerous." The pastor looked surprised. "You were right about that. Winter leaves no room for experiments. I only had room for preparation, and even then, it almost wasn't enough." Pastor Alden nodded slowly. "Then why keep it?" Silas looked at the small hood by the east wall. Beyond it, Ruth was helping Amos plant onion sets in the thawing garden soil. Eleanor stood on the porch in sunlight, her face turned toward the warmth. "Because a house isn't strong just because it keeps everything out," Silas said. "A house is strong when the people inside can still find a way through." In the years that followed, other cabins around Crow's Crossing began changing. Not all of them built Silas's exact passage. Some added low vent boxes behind their stoves. Some placed marked shovels inside their homes. Some raised chimney markers higher above the roofline. Some built sheltered crawl openings under porches where a person could reach air if doors and windows disappeared beneath a drift. They called them Avery vents. Silas disliked the name. He said they were simply openings made on purpose. But the idea stayed. Years later, when Ruth was grown and married, she told her children about the blizzard of 1886. She did not tell them that her father had been fearless. She had seen the fear in him when the lamp flame went still. She had heard it in his silence before he crawled into the snow-filled passage. Instead, she told them something truer. She said fear was not the same as helplessness. Her father had been afraid. Everyone in that cabin had been afraid. But when the chimney closed, when the door disappeared, when smoke began filling the room, he did not waste time wishing for a different storm or a stronger house. He watched the smoke. He followed the air. And he remembered that the opening everyone laughed at was still there. The blizzard had tried to turn the cabin into a sealed box. It had pressed snow against the door, buried the chimney, and searched every crack in the walls. It had taken almost everything people believed made a house safe. But it could not take the second breath Silas had built into the east wall. That was why the smoke saved his family. Not because smoke was kind, not because fire could defeat winter, but because in the darkest hours of the storm, smoke showed them when the air was moving, when the cabin was breathing, and when there was still one path between the people inside and the frozen world beyond the wall. Sometimes survival does not look like a fortress. Sometimes it looks like one small opening placed where no one else would think to look. And sometimes the strongest thing a person can build is not a wall against the storm. It is a way for life to keep moving through it.